Hi, my name is Alfred Ubiora Uzokwe. I'm a civil engineer here in Pennsylvania. Now, it seems like every time I get videos from friends, families, and people who read my writings from Nigeria, it's a video about destruction, flood destruction in Nigeria. Buildings are being inundated, bridges being destroyed, dams being breached, roadways being made worse than they are. From my perspective, what we're dealing with is climate change. See, when I was growing up in Nigeria decades and decades ago, we had a defined rainfall pattern, whereby in April, the rainy season begins, starts raining until August, and we have what we used to call August break. And then the rain will peter out a little bit and then pick back up going into September, October, and dry season comes in. And that dry season lasts till the next year. All this with climate change is now out the window. There's a new rainfall pattern, which is almost like it rains all the time. Sometimes it rains in December. And once the year turns around, January, February, you start hearing about intense rainfalls. This is the effect of climate change. Part of what, of course, triggered this is too much of greenhouse gases in the air, carbon and things like that. But it's not just peculiar to Nigeria. It's occurring in almost every nation on the face of the earth. The difference between them and Nigeria is that most of these nations, especially the Western nations, are taking steps. They have groups, well-funded, given research, looking at the effects of climate change and how to respond. And they are responding. I've been to a couple of seminars and conferences where climate change, people from all over the world coming, and they're talking about what their nation is doing about climate change. Now, there are three major ways to adapt, especially, and remember, I'm talking about this from the perspective of infrastructure, buildings, culverts, bridges, dams, roadways, and so on. There are three ways to respond. The first one is mitigation. The second one is adaptation. The third one is building of resilience. Well, mitigation, we are behind the eight ball in Nigeria because what it is simply is taking steps in a nation to make sure that more carbon, more greenhouse gases are no longer being let into the air. That is something that a mammoth task for Nigeria, where people have to use generators, and every time you use generator, you're letting out greenhouse gases into the air. People are burning tires everywhere and trash and letting gas into the air. With that, climate change will continue. Let's just say for now that we're not able to handle that. The second one is adaptation, where we say, okay, we acknowledge the fact that climate change is here. How do we design or redesign or rebuild our infrastructure to take account the climate change and much rain, much heat, and things like that? That is where we are. Resiliency building is simply designing to make sure that the infrastructure is tough enough when it rains or when there is high heat, the infrastructure is able to withstand it. That costs a lot of money. So let's stay with adaptation. Say, for example, culverts. From civil engineer perspective, every culvert simply has an opening through it, through which stormwater flows when it rains. Well, what we have to do or say to our designers and engineers for our culverts is to say, if you designed this culvert years ago to accommodate 50-year storm, with climate change, you now have to redesign it to accommodate maybe 100-year storm, which means that if your culvert is 4 feet by 4 feet, you now have to rehabilitate it to make it maybe 6 feet through calculation, 6 by 6, make it larger, so that all this rainfall that we're getting will be able to flow through the hydraulic opening. We call it hydraulic opening. And of course, you make the covers stronger through the type of concrete that you use for it. Now, say for buildings, having a legislation that simply says, it breaks my heart when I look at all these fine buildings in places like Victoria Island, Lekki, and so on in Nigeria, where every time it rains, all these highbrow buildings are flooded and inundated with water. Remember years ago when we saw, after rainfall, people using their boats to travel on the streets of Lekki and Victoria Island. That shouldn't be. Already those buildings are designed, but what we can say is have a legislation that says for certain areas that are susceptible to flooding, they must be designed, new buildings, to not have their ground floor on grade. You put them on metal or concrete stilts, raise them from the ground level, so that when it rains and you have all this big flooding, it will flow below and not into the buildings. And so, the other thing we need to do is for buildings that are already existing, there is such thing as detention and retention ponds. Very simple concept. You dig a big ditch near the building estate. When it rains, the excess rainwater actually flows into those ditches and then slowly infiltrates into the ground, so that excess rain will not be flowing into residential areas. It's used everywhere. In the development where I live here, there is one that catches all the rainwater so that it gets dry. Every time it rains here, before you know it, everywhere is dry because the excess rainwater flows into the detention and retention ponds and so on. For dams, everybody is aware of what happened in Borno, where a dam was breached. Well, it was breached maybe because the construction was not good enough, but mainly because of excess rainwater. So what do? There's what we call spillway. You increase the capacity of the spillway, which controls the dam, so that if it rains too much, the water will be able to have an outlet and not breach or get destroyed. Roadways, of course, we're in a situation where there are bad roads everywhere. And you think to yourself, what are our engineers designing? Is it the fault of the engineers or the contractors? I don't know. But what I have observed is that poor workmanship. You look at the road, you look through the cross-section, you find out that the thickness of the constituents, subgrade, subbase, and then asphalt, are so thin that it's easy for these roadways to be washed out. We get legislation on paper that says before you're paid, there must have to be, inspection. I used to be a construction engineering inspector, and we did all this. You inspect it to make sure that work that is being done is of high caliber and high grade. And then I've seen roads in Nigeria where you look and you don't find roadside gutters. Or in situations where you have roadside gutters, you find out that the capacity of the roadside gutters are so small that 5 minutes after the start of a rain, the gutters are already full and the excess water will flow overland into residential areas. So we make sure that designs for these places take into consideration climate change and increase the capacity or the size of the roadside gutters, so that when it rains, the water will flow into the gutters and out without destroying the roadway. I've also seen designs of roadways where the height of the gutter on the side is higher than the road itself. Water does not flow upstairs, it flows down. So if you have the gutters there that are on higher elevation than the roadway, the tendency is that when it rains, it's not going to be able to flow into the gutter. What it does, it barrels down, goes into farmlands and building developments, and so on. I've also seen situations where you have roadside gutters, all right, but citizens do the wrong thing. They use it as trash receptacle. After drinking pure water, plastics, they throw it into them. When they have condemned and old tires, they take it, throw it into the gutters. What happens? It gets clogged. And when it gets clogged, the water already inside the gutters becomes stagnant and become health hazard because malaria, mosquito breeds there and cause malaria for people in the area. These are things we have to be very conscious of. And every roadway has to have either horizontal grade or lateral grade so that water will either go this way or go that way. I've seen roadways that are just sitting on flat land. When it rains, the rainwater will be ponding. The danger in there is when you have ponding on roadway, slowly the water will start infiltrating through the asphalt and destroying the subgrade. Very soon it will become weak. When you have heavy transportation go over it, it will create potholes. From there, the road goes to pieces. And then, of course, another thing that citizens don't do, when I see pictures of beautiful, magnificent mansions in Nigeria, but then you look around the landscape, you find out that everywhere is concreted or interlock paved. And I continue to wonder why people do this, because what you do is once you interlock everywhere, rainwater will not find where to infiltrate into. So it percolates, goes out from maybe an opening from your perimeter wall and goes into the street. Rainwater from this building will enter the street, from another building, enter the street. Before you know it, it becomes a flowing danger, develops velocity and starts eroding things along its path. That's why we have all these roadway destructions. We have to have legislation through local governments and states that say, anytime you build a building in your compound, I don't care if it's your land or anything, you must make sure that only about 1/3 of the landscape is concreted or interlock paved. The rest will have grasses and trees. What grasses do is slow down the flow of rain and allow that rainwater to infiltrate right there without going out of your compound. What do trees do? Remember when we studied biology way back, elementary school, they talk about trees and taproot. Once they establish roots and so on, those taproots bind the soil together and prevent or minimize erosion. These are things we have to be very conscious of. I hate to say, in Nigeria, I call it developing legislation, because sometimes in our nation, you have to force people to do things. So I hear people say, yeah, Alfred, we have to eat first before we talk about this your climate change. Well, it's not my climate change, it's all our climate change. The destructions will be affecting everyone. Nigeria as a nation or as states can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can be trying to get our economy in order while also combating climate change. Get together groups in local governments, in states, at federal level, fund them enough to continue to go out, see what other nations are doing to combat climate change infrastructurally, and do the same. Otherwise, we're in trouble. The Igbos will say, "Welo tutu wechobe udioji." In other words, a stitch in time saves 9. This is Alfred Obiora Uzokwe speaking from Pennsylvania.